Chapter 14, Other Diatonic Seventh Chords. Now, the last two chapters focused on the dominant seventh chord, but you should keep in mind that any diatonic chord can be built up to the seventh. And to explore those structures, we need to catalog all of the common sonorities of the seventh chord. The easiest way of doing this is to look at the quality of the triad and then look at the quality of the seventh. For example, the dominant seventh chord, let's say in the key of C, is the G chord, the 5 chord, and this is the seventh. So in order to just get a handle on what we call the quality of the chord, we see it's got a triad, which is a major triad, right? Major third and minor third. And it's got a seventh. The triad is major. The seventh is a minor seventh. You should get good at knowing what kind of sevenths you're dealing with. Now, a lot of people can get the interval of the seventh pretty easily if they look at the octave. Look at the octave first. If the seventh is only a half step lower than the octave, then it's a major seventh. But if the seventh is 2 half steps lower, like a whole step lower, then it's a minor seventh interval. So this chord is a major minor seventh chord, like this. By the way, if the seventh is 3 half steps lower, then that's a diminished seventh. Okay, so here's a chart of all the most common seventh chord qualities, and this is all based on a C chord. You can see that this chord would be called a major with a major seventh on the top, right? It's only a half step lower than the octave. This is a major minor seventh chord. You can see the 2 half steps lower. This is a minor triad with a minor seventh, so we call it a minor minor seven. And this is a diminished triad with a minor seventh, which we call a diminished minor 7 chord. And this is a diminished triad with a diminished seventh. You can see it's 3 half steps lower than the octave. So those are the chord qualities that we need when building sevenths. Now can also be called pop symbols. Like this is the C major 7. This is the same thing as a major major 7. The C7 is a major minor 7. The C minor 7 is a minor minor 7. And the C, we call this half diminished. This is a C half diminished 7, which is the diminished minor 7. And then the C fully diminished, which is the diminished 7 chord. So you should get used to those different chord qualities, because now if you look at the 7 chords within a key, they all have different qualities. The 1 chord is major minor 7. I'm sorry. The 1 chord is major major 7. The 2 chord is minor minor 7. The 3rd is minor minor 7. And the 4 is major major 7. The 5 is major minor 7. And the 6 is minor minor 7. And the 7 is diminished minor 7. That's quite a mouthful, a lot there in that chart. But, musicians do. They memorize what the qualities of each of the scale degrees are in the major, as well as the minor. Let's take a look at the minor. These would be the most typical chords, although there are a lot of varieties in minor because of the different kinds of minor scales. But in a minor key, here's a C minor. We'll be using either the harmonic minor, especially when we're using a chord that leads back to 1. But we also may just use the natural minor, as is the case with the 1 chord, a minor minor 7 chord, C minor 7. The 2 chord is diminished minor 7, which is half diminished. The 3 chord, major major 7, which is major 7 chord. The 4 chord is a minor minor 7. The 5 chord is the same as a major key, major minor 7. The 6 chord, major major 7. And the 7 chord, again, the same as in a major key. Almost, except for that last note. So this is a diminished diminished chord or a fully diminished chord. Now, each chord can be used in any of its inversions. Same as with triads, if you're going to use the second inversion, you should be able to label it as either a passing or a pedal chord, because that's where it's most commonly going to be used. So you could go back and check chapter 12 about usages of second inversion. In all seventh chords, the seventh should resolve stepwise down. There's really no exception to that rule, unless there's a really compelling reason in the melody where that's not going to happen. And then be really careful to the resolution of the leading tone of the chords, as always. If the leading tone is in an outer voice, like in the soprano or in the bass, you should resolve it by a half step up. The diminished seventh chords, the half diminished chords that we find on scale degree 7 in a major key, or on scale degree 2 in a minor key. And then we've got the fully diminished 7 chords that we find on scale degree 7. You can put them in any inversion. All right, you can even put them in root position. That's unlike triads, so they're quite flexible. Some of the seventh chords are more typical than others, like the one chord with a seventh is actually not very typical until you get toward the very end of the 19th century. Now, the first seven chords you should become familiar with are the two chords, because these dominant preparation chords are extremely popular in either a major or a minor key. So take a look at some of these examples. Here's in the key of C. Here's the two chord. And here is the two chord built to the seventh. So it's a 2-7. And if I'd voiced it, it might be something like this. Here's the seventh. Here's the 5-7. And going to 1. Now, just as you did when you learned about dominant seventh chords, you may find yourself needing to leave a note out of a chord in order to make good voice leading. So in this example, the 2-7 going to 5-7, you might notice that there's a note missing, the D. So you can leave the fifth out of the 5-7 chord. Here's another example where the 5-7 chord is complete. We're going to do the 2-7 chord again, but this time I'm actually leaving the fifth out of that chord. This is example B. Going into the 5-7, complete chord, and then to the 1 chord, leaving the fifth out of the chord. So be careful. If you're going to put those chords all in a root position, you're left with the same issues that you had when you did dominant 7 chords in root position. It's often the case that you're going to need to leave out the fifth of maybe the 2 chord, or maybe the 5 chord, or maybe the 1 chord in order to make good voice leading. Once you put these chords in inversion, a lot of those issues go away. As you can see in example C, here's the 2 chord in first inversion, complete chord, going to 5-7, and then going to 1. And here's example D. In this one, we managed to get complete chords all around. This is a 2-6-5. Notice that the third is in the bass. To a 5-2. Notice the seventh in the bass. And then the 1-6. In a minor key, the 2 chord is half diminished. Half diminished. Minor. I'm sorry, diminished triad with a minor seventh. So this is example E. You should go ahead and check your understanding 14.1, in which you have to try to resolve 2 chords that are built up to the seventh. Okay, let's talk about the 7 chord. The 7 chord in a major key is diminished with a minor 7, and we call that half diminished. In a minor key is diminished with a diminished 7. So we call that fully diminished. So these are very common 7th chords, and they function just like dominant. Like the 5-7, they both contain a leading tone and a chord tone seventh. But unlike the 5-7, it is possible in the root position 7 half diminished and 7 fully diminished chords to resolve both the leading tone and the chord tone seventh strictly without using any incomplete chords. So that's one of the advantages of using the 7 chord as a dominant chord. Here's some examples. We're in the key of C. We're going to take the 7 chord. I'm going to go down to find the 7th chord. And I'm going to voice it like this. Here's the 7th. Here's the leading tone in an outer voice and resolve to the 1 chord. Here's example B. I'm just going to revoice it. The root, the 3rd, the 5th, the 7th, and I'm going to resolve the 7th down and the leading tone up to the 1 chord. And here is the half diminished chord. Another voicing. Here's the root, the 3rd, the 5th, and the 7th. And I'm going to resolve the 7th down and the leading tone up. This one actually is a little bit problematic. If you're watching this really carefully, you might see, watch these two voices, the tenor and the soprano. When they go down, we actually have a parallel 5th there. Do you see it? It's a problem when you are trying to resolve the 7 half diminished 7 chord that you might get parallel 5ths. Okay, so one way that you can avoid that is to do an irregular doubling. Instead of letting that one come down, let the tenor actually go up and join the alto. And then you can't see it here on the piano, but you actually have 2 E's. So that is one of the unfortunate aspects of the half diminished chord when in root position when you're resolving it. What some composers do, even when they're in a major key, they decide to use a fully diminished chord, which is a sort of an altered version of the 7th chord, even in a major key. And then they don't have to worry about the parallel 5ths. You can go ahead and check your understanding 14.2, and you'll get a chance to try some of these 7 half diminished and fully diminished 7 chords.